Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Tension of Opposites. This is Elena, coming back from the dead once a year, as I usually do, and I am recording this on a whim, because I just have been thinking about this for a while, and I still don't know why my brain keeps insisting that this needs to happen, but this is happening. So here we are, today, talking about podcasts on a podcast. I'm just going to take a second to interject myself here to tell you that there are two Elenas who have recorded this episode. The Elena from yesterday who decided to talk about this without any prior planning or experience or any notes on hand. And the Elena of today who is editing said episode and realizes that there are maybe some extra comments that could be done. So I will be interjecting myself throughout the episode and just offering some comments. I think it will be quite obvious to see who is who when we're speaking. There might be some dogs barking in the background today, but my thoughts are a bit more clear. And yeah, I feel like I can provide a bit more context to what I was doing before. So I don't know if this is a thing that has been done, but this is how the structure is going to be today. Back to you. And I think the reason why my brain keeps pushing this is that this year it has been obvious that there's been an evolution of what this format and market has had, especially since the pandemic, which was a turning point where podcasts maybe were always something that was a bit more niche because generally not everyone enjoys listening to other people for such long extents of time, especially if it's not random content, you're not really sure what you're in for. But I think during the pandemic, people just got used to this kind of format and it works and it kept them company, especially in a very lonely time. And now it's just very mainstream. It's an extension of someone's brand. It's becoming a money-making business. So you can see so much more content that is being derived from it, but also an oversaturation that comes from it. And I know that I speak about it as yet another person with yet another podcast, but even the kind of podcasts that are coming out now feel very different from the ones that I used to be seeing in earlier years. So I've been listening to podcasts for over 10 years now. So I'd like to start with at least how it began for me. When I started the podcast, this one, I thought, okay, before I even started, I have to know everything about it, because otherwise how can I start it? Which is just procrastination 101, basically. And I bought Podcasting for Dummies, which is a big-ass book. Like, there's no need for that book to be that big. And I think I went through probably the first 3 chapters and then I let it go before, drum roll, just checking on the internet and YouTube and just making it up as I go. But anyways, I had this book, I was reading through it, and from what I remember, podcasting started unofficially around 2004. It was audiophiles that they didn't really have a podcasting host website at the time. I don't remember if it was maybe something through blogs and then they were compressed into this sort of audio format. But in the beginning, it definitely came from other shows, especially radio, and then they moved to a podcasting format. Okay, so in this case, I remembered correctly and I was right on the money. Podcasts started becoming popular in 2004. They started in 2003 with the first modern podcast that was launched by Chris Lydon and David Weiner. It was called an audio blog post back then. And then in 2004, The Guardian writer Ben Hammersley coined the term podcast by combining the words iPod and broadcast. So podcasts were previously known as audio blogs, and it could be described as on-demand radio because they were audio shows that were available in episodes and listeners could find and download online. So instead of turning on the radio, listeners would use a podcast listening like Apple Podcasts or Spotify to subscribe it and listen to their favorite shows when the new episode would drop. Then it got to podcasting hosting websites and distributors and so on, but this article from Riverside actually categorizes different historical phases of podcasts, which is really interesting. So from 2004 to 2005, that is considered the beginning when these podcasting platforms start to arise and the term podcast is coined. The rise of podcasting will be described between 2006 and 2013, which is around the time that I started listening to it, 2013. And then from 2014 and 2018, we have this idea of the narrative and prestige of podcasts, especially when we're talking about true crime podcasts and narrative podcasts. And what is considered now, so from 2019 onwards, especially with the pandemic, we're considered to be in an era where there's a battle for market share among the biggest streaming platforms. So for me, my first experience with my first podcast, which was my quote-unquote gateway drug, if we can call it that way, was this Italian radio show, which talked specifically about the dark side of musicians and their demise, very famous musicians. And then afterwards, it sort of evolved into criminal psychology, sociological experiments, serial killers, and just in general stories, just storytelling. So to provide a bit more context on the program, because I will be talking about it in Italian and I'm obsessed by the show. Everyone who knows me knows how obsessed I am by it. It's an Italian radio show which went on from 2007 to 2013. It reprised for a little bit in 2016 and then it completely stopped at the end of 2016, and now it's going on with some other episodes, but it's picking up very slowly. But safe to say that when I picked it up, it was in 2013, so I had years of content that I could listen to, and I was absolutely fascinated by this man. He is an Italian novel writer called Carlo Lucarelli, and in the beginning he was always talking about very specific, very American stories, and mainly how they came to be, how it ended up, and then he started also transitioning to Italian stories, whether it just be a documentary type show, mainly based on crime, but the first ones were people that I never really heard of before. So he was talking about Jeff Buckley and Peter Tosh and Sam Cooke, Jimi Hendrix, and then it went on to crime stories with Charlie Manson or the trial of O.J. Simpson. And through him, I really fell in love with both the music of people that I hadn't listened to before, the fascination of the story behind these authors that you never really hear from, and then also with crime in itself and storytelling and the way that you can be so involved and entranced by someone else's life that you have no idea that this person existed before that. And it has absolutely no influence in your life whatsoever, but it's a story that sticks with you. Like, I still remember all the stories that he talked about, and there are many. Especially Italian-based stories, because I wasn't really that keen on Italian history, I guess, or Italian culture and knowledge, and the cultural knowledge that started from this was insane. Especially the evolution into sociological experiments. I'm trying to see if I can find something here, because I'm looking at all the lists. Like, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, wow, I want to listen to all of these all over again. I just love them so much. So like the case of McMartin School, Rodney Alcala, the serial killer, Waco Massacre. I love them. I was so fascinated by it, and I think it was my first entry into criminology and criminal psychology. Even though I didn't really do much with it, it's still a big chunk of the kind of podcasts that I listen to, besides many other that we will be getting into now. So I started listening to it when I was 16, and literally every time I would go home, I would have lunch, put on a new episode, fall asleep, wake up really late, just do my homework. And when I was doing my homework, I was always listening to other podcasts because there were so many. Like, I started quite late and there was a lot I could listen to before. And I don't remember if there was an actual app at the time or I would just listen to it from the website of the radio. But it started becoming the thing that kept me company. And at least for me at that age, I wasn't really keen on the conversations that were happening around me. When you're 16, you're very limited into what you're surrounding yourself with in terms of reality. My forms of escapism would be either watching TV series, American TV series, and dreaming about living in the States. Or pretty much that's it. Like, you're not really interested in speaking to your family as much. And even with friends, it's always that insecure moment where you don't know where you belong and you don't know if what you're saying is intelligent or if it makes sense. And for me, I was very much a proponent of, if I don't think I'm saying something smart, I would rather not say it. So I remember that sometimes, especially as being a younger kid of the family, I would be a witness in these conversations around me. And I would imagine in my head how I would reply to a conversation if I had more confidence or if I thought that what I said was smart. And it was like this extra conversation I was having in my head, but that I didn't have the courage to say. And I think with the podcast format, especially once I transitioned to conversation type podcast, it was the same thing. It was the same format. I was witnessing a conversation where there wasn't the pressure of me having to participate in it, but I could understand what they were saying. I could get notes from it. I could understand if maybe one form of expression was to my liking or not. And I think definitely all the fluency that came in the way that I express my feelings and my thoughts, and also, I guess, the openness to what I've been exposed to is due to those conversations. Conversations with people whose name I don't know. I don't know anything about their lives, but I've had the honor, in a sense, to witness yet another point of view, an opinion. And I don't really think that that is something that you get to access at that age when you're a teenager. For me, it was obviously a very particular case because then when I went to the States, I had so many conversations. And that, in fact, was a time where I wasn't listening to any podcasts, but I was listening to so many opinions, things that were like completely out of my reality and norm. And so definitely that expanded my mind in another way. But I remember that when I was in the States, the sister of my host dad, when I was in LA, she made me listen to a TED Talk. I don't remember what the TED Talk was about. Okay, so I ended up looking for the TED Talk that I was talking about. All I could remember was a mention of Theodore Roosevelt. That's all I could remember. But I don't remember what the TED Talk was about. And I found it. I think it's this one because it checks out. It was published in 2014. I was there in 2014, so it was a recently published one. And it's literally called How the Teddy Bear Taught Us Compassion. Which is just so random. It's just a very random TED Talk of, I'm pretty sure I'm butchering his name, John Moallem? I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. And it says, in 1902, President Theodore Roosevelt legendarily spared the life of a black bear and prompted a plush toy craze for so-called teddy bears. Writer John Moallem digs into this toy story and asks us to consider how the tales we tell about wild animals have real consequences for a species' chance of survival and the natural world at large. As an introduction to what TED Talks are, I feel like this is just so random. It wasn't even related to maybe anything I might be interested in or an author that I knew. And I think that is exactly the beauty of TED Talks. And it's still on my bucket list to be able to attend a full TED conference. I've been to one, but it was just an afternoon thing. But definitely aiming for that. I remember listening to it and I was thinking, my God, this is amazing. So there's a format, there's a conference where people go and they just share their ideas on things. That's it. Like with no specific agenda or topic, or you don't have to be famous. You just go and you share your opinion. To me, that was mind-blowing. And I found it so interesting that you could, again, have these kind of conversations. Because there was a bit of a dichotomy between what I was seeing on YouTube and what I was listening to in terms of podcasts. So on the podcast format, I was learning about news stories of historical figures, of social experiments, just things that were, I guess, part of general knowledge. And then with the TED Talks, I was just listening to different ideas, which I found amazing. I remember I was so mind blown by that. And that's just pushed me right through the self-development phase, which was full on. And I remember listening a lot to Oprah. Oprah Winfrey was a big one in terms of religion and spirituality and self-development. When I was dabbling with veganism and I wanted to know what that was about, there was another person who had a podcast since 2005. And every time I would listen to a new one, I would start from the beginning. So I had so much content I could listen to. And I think at this point it would be interesting to jump in and just give a bit of a sense of the kind of podcast that I listen to. I listen to a lot. I'm actually looking at a document here because my plan is to be able to share at least once a month podcasts that I would recommend, that I've been listening to for a long time. But there's so many categories of podcasts that you can listen to. So the easiest ones and the first ones that come to mind are the mini-series, whether they be like audio documentaries of not more than 10 episodes. They come out once a week. And they're really good and riveting, and those are the easiest that you can go through if you're not really into podcasts in the first place. The one that comes to mind that I will always be mentioning till the end of time is Dolly Parton's America. I wasn't that big of a fan of Dolly Parton before this, and really loved it. Then other ones that I really listen to are, as I said, crime podcasts, psychology, very into sociology and criminal psychology. So I like, as much as I would never want to see like very harsh things on video and on film, very much into the stories of serial killers, sociological experiments, cults. I'm so obsessed with cults. I think they're really interesting. Historical podcasts also are super interesting. I think podcasts are such an amazing format to be able to bring to life things that would have been so boring to learn, in the traditional way on books. Very much into health and fitness for whatever reason. I am not a health and fitness junkie by any means, but I think listening to people who talk about this in such a natural way, you're just listening to triathletes and their plan, their meal prep and their fitness plan for the new marathon that they're doing. And I just listen to that. I'm like, yeah, sure. I relate to everything that you're saying. Really, truly, yes. I don't know, just gives me the illusion that I'm part of this group that I'm not part of. As I said, religion and spirituality are also a big thing. I don't belong to any specific religious group, but it's so interesting to be able to learn about different denominations and just spirituality in general, which is much broader than organized religion is. And then very niche random ones, whether it can be about nutrition. I remember one of the minimalists. I do listen to my fair share of celebrity podcasts interviewing celebrities, because at the end of the day, we all have the level of curiosity as well. Like, we want to know what goes on in their lives, especially when they're like celebrities that are not really big on social media. So I do have that as well. And yeah, just very niche ones. Again, comedy is also a really, really big thing. I really, really enjoy comedy. So it's nice when it's either like comedians who have a podcast, like for example, Conan O'Brien, and then also Italian ones with Italian comedians. Use it a lot for news as well. So now the big trend is that news agencies will have a condensed 5-minute podcast every morning that they can share, and I like that way more than watching the news. And yeah, that's pretty much it. There's a lot of them to share, and my plan will be now to be sharing once a month a podcast that I will recommend, and based on the amount of podcasts that I listen to, this segment can go on for years, literally. And then on the other hand, on YouTube, it was the rise of YouTubers, which weren't really considered influencers or vloggers or anything. They were just YouTubers, but it was becoming that phase where YouTubers were starting to post content more consistently every time. So I thought that was really interesting to just see the mundane day-to-day life, where the conversation was very basic. They could talk about hours about very basic things. So when they were going to school, what they were buying, what they were making for dinner. And there was something so fascinating about the idea of being able to witness someone else's life like that someone would open their life so much to you. And it feels weird to me now to think how fascinating that was, and that still is. Like, people would still watch people's vlogs. I have YouTubers that I follow since 2015, and I still watch their vlogs from time to time. It feels so relaxing. I can't understand if it's maybe a form of trust that this person is giving to you, in a sense that you can access their life. I don't know what is lacking in the real life, quote unquote, that makes the fact that this is available on the internet so much more comforting. I'm not really sure yet what is the fascination with that, but I was fully in. And I love the fact that there were people sharing their new diets or fitness routines or experiments that they were doing or social things that they were going to, seeing and witnessing the evolution of someone's life. It felt really interesting to be able to have such close relationships with someone that you don't know, which now I realize I like developing parasocial relationships. And on the podcasting hand, it just felt that was my full knowledge network of things that I could listen to, and they would just enhance my perception in my day. And that was in stark contrast with my day-to-day life, because I felt that I was just surrounded by very basic and normal conversations. When you are especially younger, the expectation is that you're not really interested in so many different things, and you're just talking about your day-to-day life, and you're going to classes, and you're going out, and you're trying to make friends again. And the stakes, especially when you're always hanging out in big groups, are always that. You're always just talking about the same things. And so to have an opportunity where you can be part of, quote unquote, a community where you're talking about everything and anything, and you're like, wow, okay, it never even crossed my mind. I don't know, the conditions of the coral reef in Australia. And now I listened to a podcast about it, and now I know more about it. It was so interesting, and it was a format that worked for me so much compared to traditional media and television. Because, first things first, it wasn't always a given that I had access to TV. Because if someone else wants to watch something different, or if you're at a dinner table and people don't want to talk about the same thing that you're talking about, It's something that I could do in my alone time, something that could keep me company when I was doing other errands. I just enjoyed all of it. And the self-development was definitely the biggest chunk of the kind of podcast that I was listening to. I definitely relied on it as a therapy before I actually started going to therapy, because it just offered so much validation. It's always a very encouraging space. You don't really listen to an audio format of people bashing one another, or at least I haven't entered that dark side of the internet. I think that kind of content is always a bit more on YouTube, or something that is visual, where you can see maybe the embarrassment of someone, or it's more visual, it's more sensationalized, it's more quick. I don't think people are necessarily keen on sitting through 3 hours of an interview just to hear negative things occur. Usually when you listen to these kind of podcasts, especially the conversation ones, even if there is a confrontation maybe between the host and the interviewee, at the end of the day, it's always, it's cordial, because that's the whole point. If I am inviting you to my space, that is what I am expecting out of it, and not necessarily a confrontation, not a TV-like debate. And I always enjoyed that, and I always wish that that could be a bit more the reality of things. But I think there's also a legitimacy that comes with having a microphone in front of you that, I guess, puts you on your best behavior. On the one hand, it's a more natural environment in which this is happening, but on the other, I think you feel like you want to have a good conversation and give a good impression. And maybe in person, you carry it to a certain extent. I mean, if you think of your day-to-day interactions, how often or how many occasions do you have to be that intimate with someone, that open, that deep, with undivided attention? I have noticed that when I started interviewing people myself, because obviously, for obvious reasons, your phone has to be on silent, we're having a conversation, you need to give me fully your attention. Every time I would listen to these kind of conversations, I would always wish that that would translate more into real life. But I guess it also depends on the circumstances that you have, given that this stage of life, you end up doing things more in a group context. And then I think as you grow older, you start doing your own thing more. I think it's really interesting to see how one random piece of content can just take you down a rabbit hole that will lead you into something that is another interest or another passion. But I think this comes also from the lack of having a physical community around you, especially when you are in a situation in which you're traveling all the time and you're going to new places. It's really hard to be in a place long enough to create a community around you where those kind of interactions can happen and where something can be pushed into social action. I, at least in my personal experience, was not raised in environments that were very embedded into community work and community knowledge. Everyone pretty much stayed to themselves, and I'm not active socially. I'm trying to do it now in most recent years, now that I've been in one place for longer, and I would like to do volunteering, and you get to meet people through the community, but I haven't lived in an environment in which community was essential for my survival, so that never really occurred. I think the need for this kind of different content around me stems also from that, from wanting to seek different opinions and different people, even if I don't know who these people are. It makes me reflect on that as well, because that access, these kind of conversation, this kind of knowledge can come from very real and physical communal spaces. But I think as people, or at least as I am evolving into very individualistic society, and you move around a lot, you need to maybe seek it out in a more intense way. And at the same time, it takes you a long time to get to the confidence and to the comfort that you would have in these conversations that you're listening to. You don't just start a conversation like that from 0 to 100. It takes a certain level of commitment, which I feel is bypassed very easily when instead you're listening to these really deep things online. It makes you realize that there are people who you align with, but also that you are modeling your opinions off of what you're listening to. And that is very dangerous, and I have been through that a lot. As I said, the way that I express myself and my impressions on the world are very much influenced by what I've listened to over the past 10 years. And now that algorithm is a real thing, I am sure that certain things have been tailored to my content and now I just live in a very specific bubble. So you get to listen to different opinions, but I think now you kind of always stay within that same network of community. So you're not really branching out either. I mean, it would be really interesting. I don't know how actively I would need to look for the exact opposite opinion and alignment of values that I have and listen to where they're coming from and what they're thinking. But as now podcasting has gone hand in hand with influencers, which go hand in hand with social media, it feels like everything is interconnected in that way as well. So you're still living in a very specific bubble. And you just listen to other people's opinion, but again, you're not really witnessing, you're not really participating, you're not telling your thing. So you're forming an identity, in a sense, also based on things and people that you don't know. Because this is a conversation, but I guess you don't really see the extent of the consequences of developing your thoughts on other people fully. So it's interesting. If that were translated into real life conversations, maybe it would bring to much different opinions than what you have heard. And now the way that podcasting is evolving is definitely through famous people who have podcasts. And that is also different as well, because that's basically just another service that is given to a following base that is coming in. So I think that does influence you to a certain extent. I am still consuming a lot of content that I'm liking. I'm seeing a lot of things that are of my enjoyment, or they're very insightful, or they're broadening my perspective of things. But it does feel very much structured and tailored compared to the kind of podcasts that I used to listen to before, which were just very random. Like now I'm recently still stumbling upon some very, very random conversations, which are funny, and I've never had an issue with listening to 3+ hour podcasts. It feels, as I remember saying in the first episode, it feels like an act of faith, but it brings something. It never feels like wasted time to me. Now also I'm noticing with the incessant presence of social media that my attention span also is much shorter. So I can still listen to these things in the background, but it makes it harder for me to listen intensely to a conversation unless I'm seeing it visually, now that so many podcasts are on a visual format. And I remember reading this book. It's called 10 Arguments for Deleting Your Social Media Accounts Right Now, from Jaron Lanier, which I heard of him from that famous Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. Also I'm realizing that I'm not remembering things as sharply as I used to, and this thing is scaring me a lot, but anyways. And he basically contributed to the first computers at the time, and he could see a straight pattern as to where social media was headed before social media even existed. And he also gave this dystopic interpretation of how podcasts would be condensed into these bite-sized pieces of content, and that podcasts would become more and more structured to the point of being completely unnatural. Just these very, 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 very perfect and short tidbits of information. And yes, that was terrifying. The way that he explained it was really bad. I did not like it. Okay, so this is where it gets interesting. The author that I mentioned, his name is Jaron Lanier, and he is many things from what his website says. And it's very funny because he does not have any social media, being true to his word. But his website, it looks like a very poorly designed blog from the early 2000s. It's very funny because I'm pretty sure he did it on purpose. But anyways, he is an artist, he is a technologist, he is a scientist, he is a musician. But for what is of interest to us, we will be analyzing the part of technologist. So it says that his name is often associated with virtual reality research. He either coined or popularized the term virtual reality in the early 1980s. And he has been a founder or principal of 4 startups that were either directly or indirectly acquired by Oracle, Adobe, Google, and Pfizer. From 1997 to 2001, he was a chief scientist of Advanced Network and Services, which contained the engineering office of Internet 2. And from 2001 to 2004, he was a visiting scientist at Silicon Graphics Incorporated. So he was pretty much involved in the advent of the first computers and the advent of the internet. And it's very interesting to see his input because he describes that from early on he could see where this was directed. And in his book, he talks and coined this term that is called bummer. And bummer is an acronym for behaviors of users modified and made into empires for rent. The concept that he tries to bring forward is that social media sites change our behaviors in a way that is of interest to them, and that their interest is strictly financial. In this case, he had also mentioned the concept of podcasting by describing something that still hasn't been modified to the same extent that other social media accounts have. But in this excerpt, basically he brings forth the possibility, which is very probable, that this could be also modified in favor of bummer mentality, as he describes it. And so now I will be reading an excerpt from the book, which is called Pod People. And yeah, it's a bummer. He says, another way to illuminate the tricky degradation of context is to notice online situations in which it is not a problem, at least not yet. A part of the online world that hasn't destroyed its own context, at least as I write in 2018, is podcasting. It isn't bummer yet. Podcasters are real people known to the listener. Podcasts are episodic, so they build a sense of personality and context. The listener can't, as yet, jump around audio content as easily as she or he can jump around content that is presented visually, like a website or a video. So a listener's actual experience is more like the experience the podcaster imagines it will be than like what happens when someone uses a bummer feed. To make the distinction clearer, I'll invent a way to ruin podcasting. Nobody do this, okay? Some crummy person could make an app that transcribes all the podcasts available in a store and synthesizes a new artificially intelligent podcast that combines snippets from lots of different podcasts that, as one example, contain the same set of keywords. You could say, I want to hear opinions about X political candidate, or maybe about some celebrity. Then you'd hear a rapid-fire sequence of people saying things about the subject. You would not hear what had come just before each snippet or what comes next. The snippets would go by so fast, and there'd be so many of them, that even if a computer voice identified where each snippet was snipped from, you wouldn't be able to take it in. Podcasters would strive to come up with snippets catchy enough to be snagged and rolled into the sausage. There would be a lot of goofy cursing, ambushes, freaky screams and laughs, none of which meant much. AI researchers would proudly show how one podcaster's voice can be made to speak what another podcaster has said. You could get all your podcasts read by the author of your choice, what Ezra Klein says intoned by Gilbert Gottfried. Plus, personal voicemail messages would be inserted into the queue, just to up your own engagement. Maybe that would be the only way to even hear your own messages. Oh, and there would be ads mixed in. Your spouse's voice talking about that new Internet of Things sensor clothing that reports your posture to unknown targeted advertising services. In the middle of a mush of fragments of politics podcasts, a voice would talk about how a politician is running a child sex ring in the basement of a pizza parlor. Armies of trolls and fake trolls would game the system and add enough cruel podcast snippets to the mix that your digest would become indigestible. Even the sweetest snippets would become mere garnishes on a cruel, paranoid, enraging, and crazy-making sonic soup. Or maybe your aggregated podcast will be a filter bubble. It will include only voices you agree with, except they won't be really voices because the content will be all mushed together into a stream of fragments, a caricature of what listeners supposedly hold in common. You wouldn't even live in the same universe as someone listening to a different aggregation. The podcast aggregator app might be called something AI arrogant, like Podcast Meta Genius, or maybe something toddler cute, like Potty Training. If this scenario sounds preposterous and bizarre, look at what has happened to text, image, and video already. How is potty training different or worse than what people who rely on social media feeds to connect to the world already accept? Podcasts still rely on stores and subscriptions, so they maintain a person-to-person structure instead of a person-to-crowd/algorithm/hidden manipulator structure. Enjoy podcasts while you can. Please stay alert, and if podcasts are ruined, stop making them and stop listening. For now, remember that you only have the most tenuous connection to the meaning of the stuff you add to the bummer monster. Now, if that isn't depressing, I don't know what is. But I think it's such an interesting insight. And he wrote this in
2018 and now we're in 2023, and the whole conversation around AI is definitely more solidified into our brains. But the whole concept of AI wasn't that mainstream at the time. It wasn't mainstream before the beginning of this year, for example. So I see it going that way. I can definitely see it going that way, especially when I follow podcasts and now are mainstream, or maybe they were already mainstream to begin with because they came through famous people, as I was mentioning before. And you choose a podcast based on the clips that are on the podcast page that you find on Instagram. So that is already part of the algorithm, and it's already part of your bubble. I'm not saying that you don't come across interesting content anyways, but the content is being tailored to you in a way that I guess it wouldn't be before, because there was just such a huge array of content and so random that you, as a consumer, would decide what podcast you wanted to listen to based on the mood that you were at. I want to learn about X topic, and that's what you Googled, and that's what you found. And for example, on Spotify, you can't really see that much. I don't really follow the reviews of podcasts. Obviously, I mean, the first ones that will come out, if, for example, I'm Googling, I don't know, say I watched Oppenheimer yesterday, and I wanted to learn more about what happened, what was the story around the Manhattan Project and so on, I will Google Oppenheimer on my Spotify feed. And then I imagine that the first ones that are coming up are either from podcasts that I'm already listening to or the most popular ones anyways. But I don't think it's still that tailored yet, but I can definitely see it going that way. And I don't know. I find that dangerous as well. I don't know how this is going to evolve. I don't know how much of my thoughts are my original thoughts. With podcasting, at least it feels like it's my choice. I am looking for a piece of content and I'm listening to that. I'm seeing the title. I'm seeing if I'm interested in the topic. And that's where we're going. Instead, with like social media, especially Instagram, I'm not really asking for what content is being presented to me, but it's still bombarding my brain and it's still going to be there. And I still remember perfectly what reel I've seen, I don't know how many months ago, and that thought still sticks with me. I think it's getting dangerous now that it's becoming, well, it has been for a while for me, but it's becoming my primary source of information. So now even like news outlets will have a podcast format, but then also it begs the question, what is a reputable source? How many sources am I supposed to be listening to have an unbiased opinion? Does an unbiased opinion even exist? To think how much of my thoughts are really my thoughts and how much is more like influenced by community. Maybe if I had a very influential community and no social media, I would be influenced by somebody else anyways. I'm not really sure where this is going, but it begs, I guess, some sort of questions as to how much we are actively choosing to be exposed to truths, or how much we are selectively choosing something to validate our own. So we really want that level of storytelling, which we would like to access in our direct community, but we're not accessing it because we're more distracted, because our attention span is shorter, because we have all this content that we are consuming. That's what it feels like right now. I still think that having more knowledge is better than not having any knowledge at all, but I guess we're not really accustomed to understanding how to selectively choose what is a healthy amount of content to listen to for ourselves, and to what extent. Is this just a replacement of books and I listen to podcasts, or am I fully forming my opinion, my thoughts, and my values on external content alone, without really doing anything actionable from it? I'm not sure. If we met the podcasters, now we're getting really, all over the place, but if we met these podcasters in real life, like would I care? Would I want to have all that information coming from only one person? Would I trust this person with this information? This whole thing started with me thinking, I really love podcasts and I want to have a conversation on how podcasts were so important for me and they made me who I am today. And now all I'm thinking is, were they good? I mean, I think ultimately they were, simply because I definitely was looking for a certain stimuli that I didn't feel that I was finding, even for my own wrongdoings. Like, I'm not like saying, oh my God, I'm the victim here, but I was definitely looking for a certain amount of stimuli around me
which I wasn't finding. And this was an online format in which I could find this. I think this is like the equivalent of what blogs were before. Now this is just on an audio format, so it feels, I guess, a bit more intimate because you're listening to this person. And I remember there was one time where someone said, oh yeah, like I had just met this person. We're like, oh yeah, I listened to this episode that you made. And it just felt, it felt weird. Why do we feel more comfortable throwing this information into the unknown rather than saying it in person? Would we feel more as comfortable? Like, would I feel comfortable talking about this if I didn't have a microphone that would legitimize what I am talking about in the first place? But then again, I mean, I do like talking about these things. But I feel that if I were to talk about these things in person, I would bore the person because I'm too intense. If I throw it into the oblivion, the unknown, where I am putting it on my page, then it's on you. You're deciding to listen to this. I'm not forcing you. So is it maybe because we're just shy to talk about these things, to talk freely without really giving a fuck about anything to anyone and just say, listen, I want to talk about this, that's what I'm going to talk about. If I had the possibility to have these conversations at any time with my friends or family or whatever, would I feel the need to have to put them on a podcasting format? Would this be of objectively any value to anyone? Especially my kind of, like, I'm not doing any social service to the public in this case. I'm not informing you on anything. I'm just sharing my experiences. But people seem attracted to want to listen to people's experiences, regardless of what they are. Maybe they relate to it. Maybe they have no idea what this thing is and they just want to know what it's like. People are, in general, drawn to want to listen to someone's story. How does that translate to a more honest conversation and way of interacting with one another in formal environments, in face-to-face environments? I really don't know. For me, all of this was an added value, but is it just me being an overthinker and that's it? I mean, that could be as well. So I don't know. I guess we're going to leave it at that. A part 2 will come at some point, even weirder than this, I guess. And I'm going to be jumping in one last time to end this, because the end of this was very all over the place, as you can imagine the rest of the episode was. But I think it was interesting if I had any interest and or knowledge to make it more into an essay type thing. But I have absolutely no interest in doing that level of research. So we're just going to leave it at that. I think it's interesting reflection that can be done on what is the future of these formats and how much they're influencing us and how much we are simply influenced by anything around us. Like in past generations, it would have been books, it would have been music, and maybe this is just the evolution of that. And these are the new formats that are impacting us. But we don't have any historical knowledge or actual acknowledgement of what the consequences are of this amount of content in our brains. So it would be interesting to talk also about the ethics of this. But yeah, this was all over the place. This is going to be one of the things that I will be doing as well. I enjoyed it, probably more than you've enjoyed listening to this, but I don't care because this is mine. So we're going to leave it at that. So thank you for listening. And yeah, that's pretty much it. See you next time.